Auto insurance, third topic that I wanted to talk about today is broad form coverage. So it kind of ties into, and maybe I should talk about it before the rental car, because it kind of ties into the idea of lending your vehicles. If you have a broad form policy, or what it's doing is it's covering you as a driver and not a specific vehicle. So sometimes people will get this if they own like maybe 5 or 6 cars, and they're like, hey, these cars aren't worth anything, because you can't have physical damage coverage on a broad form policy. So you can't cover the vehicle, because we're not covering a specific vehicle. We're covering you as the driver. So they'll say, hey, I got 5 vehicles. They're all worth, $500 or less. And it's not worth worrying about covering the vehicle itself. So I just want to cover me as the driver. And so I think this is less expensive. You can do that. There's a couple of issues with that. One is your vehicle cannot be covered on that. So if your vehicle has value to you and you want to make sure that's covered, you're going to have insurance on the vehicle. Number 2 is when we talked about lend your car, lend your insurance. If you have broad form coverage, when you lend your car, you're not lending your insurance because the insurance isn't on the car. It's on you as the driver. And so then I let my buddy drive the vehicle and he gets in an accident. Well, and then someone goes, well, what do I care? It's his fault. So why am I worried about whether or not I have my insurance on it? The reason why is because you're the registered owner. And if, as the registered owner of the vehicle, you're responsible to maintain liability for it while it's on the road. And so you could end up in a gap of insurance coverage where they are going to sue the driver for sure. They're going to sue your buddy, but they're also going to sue you because you own the vehicle. And your broad form coverage isn't going to cover you because you weren't driving and there's no coverage on the vehicle. So now you have a gap of insurance and a lawsuit on your hands. That's ultimately your responsibility. So if you do use broad form insurance, you have to be very careful not to lend your vehicle to somebody. Or if you do, you have to make sure that even if they have broad form, I still wouldn't do it because you're still on the hook as the registered owner. So I would just say, if you use broad form insurance, don't lend your vehicles out because there's no coverage on the vehicle for somebody else driving it. It's only you driving it. So it might work if you're like, hey, I'm the only one that ever drives my vehicles. I got several vehicles that have no value in the vehicles themselves. So I'm not concerned about physical damage coverage on the vehicles. I'm only concerned about liability to others, and I'm not going to let anybody else drive it. Broad form might work for you, but you just have to be very careful with broad form because it's a very specific policy and it can leave a lot of gaps that people aren't aware of because they're used to traditional policies. And so they kind of think about it like, hey, I can lend my vehicles out. They have insurance, or I'm lending my vehicle, lending my insurance. Those things don't necessarily apply with broad form. And even if the friend that you lend the vehicle to has broad form insurance, that covers them as the driver, but it doesn't cover you as the owner of the vehicle. And if their insurance is not enough to cover the cost of the claim, the lawyers will sue you, is because you're the registered owner of the vehicle. Same thing and this kind of ties in, the registered owner vehicle conversation kind of ties into another topic, which is when you sell a vehicle. If you sell a vehicle and you don't file a vehicle sales report with the Department of Licensing, and then the purchaser doesn't file or does a title transfer, they just don't go in and do the title transfer, you are technically still the legal owner. You have to prove that you sold the vehicle. And so if the vehicle is impounded, or if you're going to get the bill from the tow company. If the vehicle is involved in an accident, you're going to get pulled into that accident. If the vehicle is abandoned or part of a crime scene, guess what? The cops are knocking on your door. Now, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be responsible, because if you can provide proof that you sold the vehicle, even though you didn't file the report of sale, you're off the hook. But they are going to make you prove that you sold the vehicle. So I know I've talked to one guy. He's like, I always take a picture of the driver's license of the person I sell the vehicle to, and I take a picture of them driving away. I'm like, that's great, but you should also make sure you go online and file a report of sale with the Department of Licensing. And then even if they don't transfer the title, it's documented that you sold the vehicle to that person, and you're completely off the hook. So that kind of ties in, right? Because the reason why you want to do that is because you don't want to get pulled into lawsuits. You don't want to get pulled into anything that happens when somebody else uses the vehicle and it's still in your name. And so the same thing with that broad form. You need to be careful because if it's in your name, you're going to get pulled into things if somebody else is driving.